They said everything Diana left behind had been catalogued. Every dress, every photograph, every diary entry. But deep inside, a locked mahogany drawer at Kensington Palace, something was found that no one was meant to see, a letter addressed only to William and sealed for nearly 3 decades. It was not part of any official inventory. It wasn't listed among the artifacts, nor whispered about in the corridors of the palace. This wasn't something meant for royal historians or the public's fascination. This was something private, almost sacred, a message from a mother to her son, untouched since the day it was written. For years, there had been a quiet legend about Diana's personal writings, pages she penned in solitude, away from prying eyes, away from the constant hum of palace politics. Some were believed destroyed, others locked away indefinitely, scattered in secure vaults and private collections. Royal aides spoke of them in hushed tones, careful never to admit what they had seen or suspected. And yet, no one imagined there might be one final piece that had never surfaced. The discovery happened not during a grand inspection or public display, but during an unpublicized archival review, a quiet reorganization of palace storage that was never meant to make headlines. An aide, working through a stack of old correspondence, noticed the unusual weight of a small box hidden in the back of the drawer. Inside, beneath decades of dust, lay a cream-colored envelope sealed in red wax, the edges crisp, despite the years. 3 people were present at that moment: the aide, a senior archivist, and one of the palace's most trusted officials. What they saw froze them in place. There, in elegant, flowing ink, was a single word: William. No title, no formality. Just his name, written in Diana's unmistakable hand. Even after all these years, her handwriting still carried a presence, a warmth, and a force that could be felt simply by looking at it. It was as though the envelope itself radiated her voice. None of them dared to open it. That decision, they knew instantly, was not theirs to make. But the question that lingered in all their minds was the same. Why would Diana write such a letter to William? And why hide it away so completely? Why not give it to him directly? Why not entrust it to Harry as well? The secrecy of it suggested something more than simple sentiment. Perhaps there was a warning inside, a confession, or a truth too dangerous to share with anyone else. The very existence of the letter challenged the narrative the monarchy had worked so hard to maintain since her passing. If Diana had felt the need to put something in writing for William alone, it meant she anticipated a moment in his life when these words would matter, a moment when her voice would need to reach him from beyond the grave. And in that instant, standing in the dimly lit archives, the weight of the envelope seemed to grow heavier. Those present felt they were holding more than paper. They were holding a fragment of history that could, in the wrong hands, shatter the careful balance of the crown. They placed it back in the box, secured it with layers of protection, and began the process of delivering it directly to William without the knowledge of anyone else in the household. Yet even as they moved in secrecy, something about the discovery resisted silence. Perhaps it was the tension in the room, the tremor in an aide's voice when recounting what had been found, or the sheer magnitude of the name written on that envelope. Whatever the cause, the story began to slip. A quiet whisper here, a suspicious glance there, and the reality of what had been uncovered began to stir the palace like an unspoken storm. And yet, before the letter could even be read, whispers began to spread. Whispers that it contained a truth powerful enough to rewrite the story of the monarchy itself. What does a mother tell her eldest son when she knows the walls are closing in? Diana's words, preserved in ink, were not just confessions, they were warnings, predictions, and an unshakable plea for William's future. The summer before her passing had been unlike any other in her life, turbulent, isolating, and marked by a sense that time was running out. The glamorous smile the world adored was still there in public, but behind closed doors, Diana was living with an almost unbearable awareness of the pressures pressing in from every direction. She had been hounded by the press, cornered by politics within the palace, and haunted by the feeling that powerful forces wanted her silenced. Every choice she made, every step she took, seemed to come with unseen consequences. In those final months, she grew fiercely protective over her children, determined that whatever storms might come, they would know the truth from her own lips, or, if she could not be there, from her own hand. Her relationship with William had always been different. Even as a young teenager, he had a quiet strength and sense of duty that she recognized and nurtured. She knew he would one day inherit not just the crown, but the weight of the entire institution. She also knew that by virtue of being heir, he would be targeted, manipulated, and tested in ways Harry might never fully experience. The letter was, in many ways, her attempt to give him a shield he could carry for life. A piece of her voice that would remain when she no longer could speak. The reasons she chose to write instead of say these things aloud were layered and complicated. Perhaps she feared someone might overhear. Perhaps she wanted her words to be preserved exactly as she meant them, without the distortion of memory. Or perhaps she sensed that the events she foresaw would come years later, and only in written form could her message survive intact until the moment William truly needed it. The first lines were tender, almost poetic, like a mother holding her child close through the page. She spoke of her pride in him, of the light she saw in his eyes even as a boy, of the way she believed he could bring humanity back to a monarchy she feared had lost its soul. But woven through these loving sentences was something far more urgent, a rhythm of caution, a pulse of warning that could not be ignored. She wrote of people in positions of trust, whose loyalty was only an illusion, of situations that would test his judgment, and of betrayals that would come wearing the mask of friendship. There were moments in the letter when her tone shifted from affectionate mother to almost prophetic witness. She hinted at names and incidents, at moments from her own life she believed William needed to remember when dealing with certain individuals. Some were veiled in metaphor, but others were strikingly clear, leaving no doubt that she carried deep mistrust toward specific palace figures. There was no malice in these words, only a fierce need to prepare her son for the dangers she believed were inevitable. As William read, the emotions were overwhelming. The love in her words pulled at his heart, but the warnings tightened around him like an invisible net. He could feel her fear between the lines, but also her faith. Faith that he would one day have the strength to face what she could not. It was not just a letter. It was a mother's final strategy, a private briefing for a future king. But as William's eyes traced her handwriting, he realized this was more than love. It was a roadmap through a minefield she feared he would one day have to cross. The letter didn't just speak of love. It named the shadows. Between tender lines of a mother's affection, there were passages so sharp, so unflinching, that they seemed to slice through the silence William had carried all his life. Diana had written of individuals powerful, entrenched, and untouchable, whose influence she believed would one day shape the course of his reign, not for his benefit, but to bend him into the image they desired. Some were members of the household itself, figures he had known since childhood, the very people who had once stood at his side in moments of grief. Others operated beyond palace walls, connected through politics, media, and international dealings. All, in Diana's mind, shared one thing: a vested interest in controlling the crown through him. She spoke of manipulation not as a possibility, but as a certainty, a system woven so deeply into the monarchy's fabric that even the heir was not immune. She wrote of hidden agendas masked by smiles at public events, of promises made in private rooms that could turn into chains when the time came for William to lead. The danger, she warned, was not in open defiance, but in quiet compliance. The ones he trusted most could be the very ones making decisions in his name, without his consent, guiding the monarchy down a path he would not recognize until it was too late. It was in these passages that she first mentioned something she called the deal. The words were underlined twice, as if to make sure he understood its weight. While she left no signed proof, her writing suggested an arrangement, a secret compromise struck in the shadows, ensuring that William's ascension would come with conditions. Certain advisors would remain untouchable. Certain voices would always be heard above his own. Certain alliances would be kept intact, no matter the cost. Diana's tone carried no uncertainty. She believed this was already in motion long before her death. Her warnings were framed with deliberate care, half of them cloaked in allegory references to storms, hunters, and foxes, as if she feared someone else might one day read her words and understand too much. But in other places, she left the mask aside and wrote names. Names of people William knew, people who still sent him Christmas cards, people who had stood beside him at official events and smiled for the cameras. The ink of those names seemed to burn more than the rest of the page because they were not ghosts from her time. They were still very much alive in his own. One line in particular sent a chill through him, a suggestion, almost casual in its delivery, that the same forces she feared for his reign may have had a hand in her own fate. It was not an accusation shouted in anger, but a quiet, deliberate observation from a woman who had been watching the board far longer than anyone realized. The implication was haunting that her absence was not merely tragic, but perhaps convenient. Reading these revelations, William felt the air tighten around him. His world, already strained by the pressures of duty, now carried the added weight of suspicion. Every handshake, every council meeting, every private conversation with senior figures suddenly replayed in his mind under a different light. He could not deny that some of the names she had warned him about were still active, still influential, still standing close enough to whisper in his ear. And if they had indeed been working in the shadows for decades, what hope did he have of escaping their reach? And as the weight of those names settled in, William realized his mother had left him something more than a warning. She had left him a challenge. He didn't cry at first. The future king simply sat there, gripping the letters so tightly that the edges cut into his fingers. For William, this was more than a personal revelation. It was a call to arms. Alone in a locked room at Windsor, far from the watchful eyes of courtiers and advisors, he read the pages over and over again, as if repetition might change their meaning. But every time his eyes traced the curves of her handwriting, the reality only deepened. The voice on the page was unmistakable. His mother's voice, alive again, in the words she had chosen so carefully. And with each line, memories rushed in, uninvited, her laughter echoing in the corridors, the way her hand would rest on his shoulder with a quiet firmness, and the rare, serious moments when she would look at him not as her little boy, but as a young man destined for something immense. Yet now, those memories carried a shadow. Her warnings no longer belonged to the past. They were a mirror held up to his present. The same names she had underlined in her letter were still part of his life. Some were close enough to know his schedule, his movements, his thoughts. He felt the weight of those connections pressing against the walls of the room, as though the palace itself had ears. His duty as heir demanded composure, diplomacy, silence in the face of provocation. But the son in him felt an entirely different pull, a need to honor her wishes, to protect the truth she had left in his hands. That truth was dangerous. If even a portion of the letter's contents reached the public, it would ignite a firestorm unlike anything the modern monarchy had faced. Accusations against trusted figures, implications about the events leading to her death, and a blunt distrust of the very institution he was born to lead, it would all become fodder for the world's judgment. The monarchy would not survive such an open wound without paying a heavy price. And so, his instinct was immediate and absolute. This letter would remain hidden, not in the palace archives, not in a locked drawer in his office, but somewhere only he knew. Not even Catherine, whose counsel he trusted above all, could see it. Not yet. Still, a vow began to take shape in his mind. He would act, but on his terms, in his time. Her words were not a demand for reckless rebellion, but a map, a strategy for a future moment when revealing the truth would protect more than it destroyed. Until then, he would guard it with the same fierce resolve she had shown in protecting him. But fate wouldn't let him wait. Within days, someone else in the palace learned of the letter's existence, and the game changed. It began with a single phone call. An unnamed insider claimed to have Diana's final truth, and was willing to trade it for the right price. The voice on the other end was calm, measured, almost rehearsed, but the words landed like a detonation. This was not idle gossip. This was someone who knew about the letter, someone outside William's control, someone who had no intention of keeping it quiet. Within hours, whispers began to circulate in places they never should have reached. Exclusive press circles, private newsrooms, and the ears of journalists who made their careers chasing royal scandal. The first hints appeared as vague inquiries, carefully worded questions posed to royal commentators and editors. But to those who understood the rhythm of palace intrigue, it was obvious someone was testing the waters. Who would bite? Who might pay? Who could be trusted to handle something explosive enough to shift public perception of the monarchy forever? Behind the scenes, the search for the leak began, and with it came a chilling realization. There was no shortage of suspects. There were aides who had once been fiercely loyal, but left the palace under strained circumstances. Former security staff with debts to pay. Even a handful of senior courtiers, still in service, who had grown resentful of the shifting power dynamics inside the royal household. Each had their own reasons: revenge, profit, leverage. And in the midst of it all, the one undeniable fact was this: the existence of Diana's letter was no longer a secret shared between William and the paper it was written on. It had entered the bloodstream of palace politics, and there was no pulling it back. The royal press office, blindsided by the sudden ripple of rumors, scrambled into crisis mode. Carefully crafted statements were drafted and scrapped before a single one was released. Meetings stretched into the early hours, with every possible strategy discussed: deny, discredit, distract. But there was a problem they couldn't solve. They didn't know what had actually been leaked. Without knowing which parts of the letter the insider had seen, they couldn't contain the damage. In the media, speculation became a storm. Headlines hinted at a final confession from the late Princess of Wales. Commentators argued over whether it contained political revelations, personal betrayals, or warnings about the future of the crown. Social media fueled the fire, spinning every old rumor into something new and toxic. The narrative was no longer in William's hands. The letter had become a weapon, one that could be wielded against him or the institution he would one day lead. William understood instantly what this meant. As long as the letter remained in someone else's reach, his mother's words could be twisted, edited, or stripped of their true meaning. The idea of her voice being used as a pawn in someone else's game was unbearable. But even worse was the possibility that, once unleashed, the truth would be buried under layers of manipulation until it resembled nothing she had written. He could feel the walls closing in, and with them, the pressure to act. And when the palace moved to silence the whispers, they didn't expect the one person who would refuse to be silenced. Catherine wasn't supposed to know, but one look at William's strained face told her there was something he was carrying, something too heavy to bear alone. She had seen this look before, in moments when the weight of the crown-to-be pressed too harshly against him. But this was different. There was a guardedness in his eyes, as though he was holding back something he feared would change everything. Over the next few days, she began noticing the smallest signs: his sudden withdrawal from conversations, the way he avoided certain topics, and the restless pacing in the quiet hours of the night. Catherine, ever perceptive, started piecing together fragments from overheard whispers, passing mentions, and the shifting tension in the palace corridors until she arrived at one conclusion: something had been found. When she finally asked him directly, William hesitated, torn between his instinct to protect her from what he now carried and the knowledge that she had always been his most trusted confidant. In the end, the need to share outweighed the fear of burdening her. He locked the door to their private study and placed the aged envelope in her hands. Catherine stared at it for a long moment before carefully sliding out the folded pages. As her eyes moved over Diana's handwriting, the warmth of a mother's love mingled with words that sent a chill down her spine. The warnings were not vague. They were pointed, deliberate, and unsettling. Diana had named individuals and painted a picture of power struggles so intricate that they stretched beyond the palace walls. Catherine could feel the emotion behind the pen strokes, the urgency, the fear, and the unwavering desire to shield her eldest son from the machinations she believed were already in motion. With each line, her understanding of Diana shifted from the public figure she had admired to the fiercely protective mother, fighting against forces she could neither fully control nor openly confront. Her mind went immediately to their own children. If the people Diana had warned about were still active, then George, Charlotte, and Louis could one day face the same dangers, the same suffocating influence that had shadowed William's life. The thought hardened her resolve. That night, long after the palace had gone still, the two of them sat in the quiet glow of lamplight, weighing their options. Revealing the letter could bring the truth to light, but would also risk igniting a scandal so volatile it might fracture the monarchy. Destroying it would silence Diana's voice forever, but ensure their family's immediate safety. It was Catherine who spoke with the certainty William could not find. She told him the letter was not simply paper and ink. It was a piece of Diana's legacy. To hide it away or destroy it would be to deny her the chance to speak from beyond the grave. In Catherine's mind, the letter had to survive, no matter the cost, because one day it might protect more than just their children. But before they could decide, events outside their control forced the letter into the light. When excerpts of the letter appeared in an international newspaper, the palace went into crisis mode, and the world demanded answers. No warning, no courtesy call, no chance to prepare. The story exploded across front pages, bypassing every layer of royal control. Someone, somewhere, had taken the contents of Diana's private words and fed them to the press in their rawest form. The leak was surgical in its precision, releasing just enough to shock the public but holding back the full scope, leaving the rest hanging in a cloud of speculation. The impact was immediate, and it was devastating. The first lines printed were not the soft words of a mother's love, but the sharp warnings she had penned with deliberate urgency. They spoke directly of individuals still occupying positions of influence, naming them as dangers to William's reign, and hinting at their role in shaping the monarchy's future in ways that served themselves, not the crown. The language was unflinching, unmistakably personal, and impossible to ignore. For the public, it was as if Diana had reached across time to speak again, her voice unaltered by the years, her courage intact. Almost overnight, a wave of sympathy for William swept across the nation and beyond. He was no longer just the heir, he was the son of a woman wronged, now carrying the burden of her final truth. Crowds outside royal residences grew larger, holding signs with her name, her image, and demands that her warnings not be buried. On social media, hashtags calling for William to finish what Diana started trended for days, drowning out official palace narratives. Inside the royal family, the effect was far more corrosive. Some members questioned the letter's authenticity, suggesting it was either forged or manipulated. Others accepted it as genuine, but warned that releasing it in full would damage the monarchy beyond repair. Private meetings turned into tense confrontations, the old fractures between tradition and change widening into open divisions. Trust, already fragile, began to collapse under the weight of suspicion over who might have facilitated the leak. The monarchy's official statement came 2 days later, carefully worded and painfully vague. It acknowledged the existence of a personal letter, but dismissed misleading interpretations in the media. The attempt at damage control backfired instantly. The statement was seen not as a defense of truth, but as an evasion, a refusal to confront the reality of what Diana had written. Public opinion hardened. Commentators on every network asked the same question. If the palace had nothing to hide, why not release the letter in its entirety? Petition after petition emerged, demanding transparency. The pressure on William was relentless. To many, this was no longer about royal protocol. It was about a son honoring the voice of his mother, regardless of the consequences. And in the chaos, William made a decision that would define his reign before it even began. For the first time, William broke royal protocol and spoke from the heart. It was not a speech written by advisors, but by a son who had finally heard his mother's voice again. There was no polished introduction, no rehearsed pleasantries. He looked into the camera and spoke directly to the people, his tone measured but resolute. He began by confirming what the palace had refused to say: the letter was real. Every word, every warning, every name written in his mother's unmistakable hand was hers. There was no forgery, no misinterpretation, no political manipulation. What the world had read was only a fragment of the truth. The rest, he said, would be preserved and, when the time was right, made known in full. He spoke of her not as the untouchable icon the world revered, but as the mother who had loved him fiercely, who had fought to protect him against forces he had only begun to understand. He told the public that her letter was not a relic of grief, but a living document, a guide for him to safeguard the monarchy from the very dangers she had foreseen. Without naming every individual, he vowed to confront those threats, to ensure the crown would never again be used as a weapon against the very family it was meant to represent. His words carried an edge, a subtle defiance that those listening closely could not miss. There was a quiet but deliberate space between him and certain senior figures in the household that night. Without directly accusing anyone, his choice of language made it clear he would not be controlled. He spoke of accountability, of reform, of a vision for a monarchy that would be transparent and grounded in service words that landed like an unspoken challenge to those who preferred the old ways. Throughout it all, Catherine's presence was unmistakable, even without speaking. She stood behind his decision to speak, offering the kind of steady support that allowed him to defy decades of precedent. He acknowledged her quietly, thanking her for reminding him that his mother's voice was not just a memory, but a responsibility. The reaction was immediate and divided. To many, it was a moment of rare courage, a prince stepping out from the shadow of palace control to honor the truth. To others within the establishment, it was reckless, dangerous, and unprecedented. International headlines praised his conviction, while whispers inside the palace warned of the chaos it could unleash. Yet, for the public, the message was clear. William was not merely inheriting a crown. He was taking a stand, one shaped not by tradition alone, but by the unshakable bond between a mother and her son. But even as he spoke, one final twist in the letter's story was waiting to be revealed. They thought they had read it all. But hidden in the fold of the final page was one last message, not for the public, not for the press, but for William alone. It was discovered by chance, when the paper caught slightly, as he placed it back into its envelope. He smoothed it carefully and noticed an extra crease, one that didn't match the rest. Tucked deep inside, almost invisible unless you knew to look for it, was a smaller slip of paper. Her handwriting just as steady, but more intimate, more deliberate. This was not meant for anyone else's eyes. This was a mother speaking to her son in a voice stripped of all pretense. The words were unlike the political warnings and guarded phrases in the main letter. They were softer, yet carried a weight all their own. She began with love, telling him that no matter the years or the distance between them, she had always believed he would grow into a man worthy of both the crown and the people's trust. She spoke of forgiveness for the mistakes he would make, for the compromises he might be forced to accept, and even for the times when the burden might seem too heavy to bear. She reminded him that strength was not in perfection, but in standing again after every fall. But then came the line that stopped him cold, written with an intensity that seemed to burn through the page. The truth will protect you when they try to break you. It was not a poetic flourish. It was a command. It told him that no matter how fierce the pressures became, no matter who stood against him, clinging to the truth, her truth would be his shield. It was as though she knew that one day, forces within his own world would test him in ways unimaginable, and that only an unshakable hold on what was real would keep him from being destroyed. In that moment, the strength he had shown in public collapsed. Alone, he let the weight of her words wash over him, and the composure he had clung to finally broke. Memories of her flooded his mind, her laugh, her fierce protection, the way she made him feel like the world outside didn't exist when she was near. This postscript, so small in size, felt larger than the entire letter. It wasn't just guidance, it was the anchor he hadn't realized he'd been missing until now. When he finally placed it back inside the envelope, his understanding of the letter shifted completely. It was no longer just a document of warnings or a political map for the future. It was a testament of love, a reminder that every step he took toward the throne was also a step toward fulfilling the hopes she had carried for him since the day he was born. The fight ahead would be long, the opposition relentless, but he now knew she had armed him, not only with strategy, but with the certainty that she believed in him completely. And so, nearly 30 years after her passing, Diana's voice once again shaped the destiny of the crown, not through whispers, but through the unshakable words of a mother to her son. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.